It's about 1 week into Lent, and somehow your scrupulosity has managed to turn it into a spiritual CrossFit program. You gave up sugar, you added daily mass, you prayed a rosary. No, not just a rosary, all of the decades. You downloaded 3 devotionals, and now you're tired and slightly suspicious that if you don't hurt more, then it probably doesn't count. And one question keeps circling. Is my penance enough? Or worse, should I be doing more? If that question sounds familiar, especially if you have a tendency towards scrupulosity, then we should talk, because Lent was never meant to become a self-designed holiness obstacle course. Welcome to the Catholic Couch, the official podcast of the Catholic Counseling Institute. And today we're talking about how 1 week into Lent is often when the emotional tone changes. The first few days usually feel clear. There's intention, maybe even a little holy adrenaline. You've chosen your penances thoughtfully, you're focused, structured, purposeful. But around day 7, the novelty starts to fade. The body begins to register the change. If you've adjusted your eating, your sleep, your routines, your nervous system notices. Dopamine drops because this is no longer new. Blood sugar might fluctuate. Emotional regulation requires more effort. And when the body feels strained, the mind looks for meaning. For someone who struggles with scrupulosity, that strain can get interpreted spiritually. Instead of thinking, oh, I'm adjusting, the thought tends to become, maybe I didn't choose something serious enough, or maybe I chose something wrong, or maybe I'm not doing this well. That leap from fatigue to moral evaluation is subtle, but it's powerful, and it's very common, especially if you struggle with scrupulosity. So let's slow down and get very concrete, because scrupulosity thrives in vagueness, but peace grows in charity. Canon law is very clear. In canon law 1249 to 1253, you will find that the church requires 2 things during Lent. Fasting. First, fasting on Day and Good Friday. Second, abstinence from meat on the Fridays of Lent. Now, let's define what that actually means. Fasting binds Catholics from age 18 until the beginning of their 60th year, so 18 to 59. What constitutes a fast? The church defines fasting as 1 full meal in a day with 2 smaller meals that together do not equal a second full meal. Snacking between meals is not permitted, but liquids are allowed. Notice that the church does not give calorie counts. It does not specify ounces. It does not provide a spiritual Fitbit. There is built-in prudence here. Now, abstinence. Who is required to abstain from meat? All Catholics age 14 and older are required to abstain from meat on Fridays of Lent. And yes, fish is permitted. This is not a loophole. That is the rule. Fish is not considered meat in the context of this discipline. So if you're having salmon on Friday and wondering if you're somehow outsmarted the system, you have not. You're simply following the discipline correctly. Also important, if someone has a medical condition, is pregnant, nursing, elderly, chronically ill, or otherwise physically unable to fast safely, they are not bound in the same way. The law of the church is not designed to harm the body. Health and prudence matter. You can fast by giving up something else. Now, here's the key point for a scrupulous soul. Those are requirements. Giving up coffee, not required. Adding daily mass, beautiful, not required. Praying the entire liturgy of the hours, also beautiful, also not required. Are these things wonderful to do? Yes. But are they binding under sin? Absolutely not. And here's another distinction that really matters. Most Lenten commitments are devotional resolutions, not formal vows. A vow, according to the Catechism, 1202 for those following along, is a deliberate and free promise made to God concerning a possible or greater good, and it binds in conscience. This is a serious act with clear intention. Most of us are not making canonical vows when we say, I'm giving up Instagram. We're making a devotional commitment. If you struggle, forget, or fall short of a voluntary devotional practice, this is not automatically a sin of lying. Lying requires deliberate intent to deceive. Catechism of Catholic Church, 1482 to 1485. Struggling with a voluntary discipline is not deception. The church's law is actually quite measured, quite clear, quite restrained, and that restraint is protective, because Lent is meant to foster conversion, not create moral panic over ounces of fish. Now that we've clarified what is actually required, let's talk about why week 1 of Lent can feel disproportionately intense. There's actually a psychological rhythm to any behavior change. When you start something new, especially something meaningful, your brain gives you a small motivational boost. Dopamine rises, there's clarity, there's energy, you feel purposeful, but then the novelty fades. By day 7 or 8, your brain has recalibrated. If you've changed your eating patterns, your body is adjusting. If you've added prayer earlier, your sleep might be slightly disrupted. If you've moved something pleasurable, your reward system is recalibrating. And when the body feels strain, the mind goes searching for an explanation. However, for someone who is prone to scrupulosity, that explanation can quickly become moral. Instead of thinking my nervous system is adjusting, the thought becomes maybe I didn't choose something serious enough, or maybe I'm not doing this well, or maybe I should intensify. Another thing that can happen is as we see or notice other people's penances, we think, well, I should probably stack their penance on top of mine. Discomfort does not automatically mean that you're failing spiritually. Remember, it simply means that you're human and you're adjusting, and that distinction is stabilizing. Now let's look at how scrupulosity can sneakily, subtly shift the tone of Lent. Say that 5 times fast. First, it becomes performance-based. Instead of Lent being about returning to God, it can start becoming about evaluating your output. Am I sacrificing correctly? Is this hard enough? Am I hurting enough? Is this enough of a punishment or penance? Second, the standard moves constantly. What felt generous last week now feels minimal. What felt disciplined now feels soft. The bar keeps rising because anxiety rarely tolerates enough. And this can be another place where hearing or seeing other people's penances can make you feel like you need to start stacking, but no penance stacking. Third, intensity gets prioritized over consistency. There can be this unconscious belief that the sharper the discomfort, the holier the practice. But holiness is more about steady obedience than dramatic intensity. In fact, Ascension did a wonderful video about this. I'll link it here. Consistency forms character. Escalation often feeds anxiety. And fourth, voluntary practices can start becoming rigid rules. The flexibility disappears, prudence disappears, adaptation disappears, and the interior posture starts to tighten. When this happens, Lent stops feeling like a relationship and starts feeling like an exam, and that was never what the church envisioned. So what is Lent actually for? The Catechism in paragraphs 1430 to 1438 speaks about interior conversion. That word interior, well, that one matters. Lent is not primarily about external severity. It's about the heart turning back to God. Fasting, prayer, and almsgiving are tools. They are not the goal. The goal is greater freedom from disordered attachment, greater clarity of desire, greater charity towards others, greater dependence on grace. If a Lenten practice is increasing love towards God, towards people in your home, it's serving its purpose. If it's increasing rigidity, irritability, and internal harshness, then we may need to pause and evaluate whether anxiety has quietly taken over the driver's seat. The Desert Fathers pursued asceticism to simplify the interior life, not to accumulate spiritual credentials. Lent is about pruning, not self-punishment for its own sake. And pruning, remember, is always ordered towards fruit. The fruit test. This slide is one of the most important diagnostic tools that you may have, in my opinion, and unofficially so, because scrupulosity tends to ask, is it hard enough? But scripture asks a different question. What fruit is it bearing? So instead of measuring intensity, we're measuring outcome. Is this practice increasing patience, increasing charity? Is it softening pride and deepening my peace? Or is it increasing anxiety, irritability, obsession, and rigidity? The fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5:22 are clear. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Chronic agitation is not on the list. Now, Lent will stretch you, and that is normal, but stretching and strangling are not the same thing. If your Lenten discipline is making you sharper with your children, harsher with your spouse, and constantly preoccupied about whether you're doing it right, then that is important data for you to pay attention to. We don't ignore fruit. We pay attention to it. Anxiety can masquerade as zeal. This is subtle, but it's critical. Anxiety often sounds spiritually serious. It uses urgent language. It feels morally intense. It pushes for escalation. But urgency is not automatically holiness. And internal pressure is not the same thing as devotion. Compulsion is not the same thing as sacrifice. True zeal flows from love. Anxiety flows from fear. And they feel very different in the body. Zeal is steady. It has clarity. It may be strong, but it isn't frantic. Anxiety is tight. It's scanning. It's always asking, what if this isn't enough? If your Lenten experience feels like you're constantly negotiating terms with an invisible auditor, that's not the Holy Spirit. That's a nervous system trying to create certainty, and certainty is not the same thing as faith. Discern your state in life. Now I need to talk about vocation, because Lent is not a one-size-fits-all. If you're a mother of small children, your Lent is going to look very different than cloistered religious. And that's not a downgrade, that's fidelity to your state of life. If you're living with chronic illness, fasting may not look like food restriction at all. It may look like offering the limits you already carry. If you're in a demanding professional season, particularly one where you're taking care of other people, your discipline may be guarding integrity, guarding your speech, or creating small but consistent pockets of prayer. St. Francis de Sales said devotion must be adapted to one's state of life, and God is not asking you to live someone else's Lent. And this is where scrupulosity can become particularly harsh. It compares your invisible sacrifices to someone else's visible ones. But sanctity, it's not comparable. It is faithful, and faithfulness looks very different in different vocations. Choose one anchor. For the scrupulous soul especially, one of the most calming choices that you can make during Lent is to simplify. There is a strong temptation, particularly among conscientious Catholics, to layer practice or penance stacking. You begin with one penance, then you add a devotional, then you add a small sacrifice, and before long you've unintentionally constructed a spiritual scaffolding that requires constant maintenance. The problem is not generosity. The problem is the escalation. Scrupulosity rarely rests with one faithful, fruitful practice. It whispers that if one is good, then three must be better. If one feels manageable, then it must not be serious enough. And before long, the interior tone shifts from devotion to management. So choosing one primary anchor interrupts this pattern. One central discipline, one clear commitment, something proportionate to your vocation and sustainable across 40 days. This reduces cognitive load. It limits the temptation to renegotiate every time anxiety spikes, and it allows depth rather than breadth. Spiritual maturity is not measured by how many practices you can juggle. It's measured by how steadily you can remain faithful to one. This slide is deeply practical, in my opinion, especially for those with scrupulous tendencies. Anxiety thrives in ambiguity. It feeds on the gray areas. It loves revisiting decisions and asking whether you really fully made them adequately. So before anxiety begins negotiating mid-Lent, define clearly what constitutes faithfulness. If you're struggling to give up sugar, decide what that means. Does it include hidden ingredients? Does it allow for pre-planned Sunday exception? Clarify it calmly ahead of time. Committing to daily prayer, define what counts. 10 minutes, one psalm, the rosary. Be specific. When expectations remain undefined, anxiety inserts itself as a referee, and it will always move the goalpost. You cannot trust anxiety with the goalpost. Clarity reduces compulsive reevaluation. This is something we do clinically in OCD treatment as well. We remove the ambiguity that fuels checking behavior. Spiritually, this serves the same function. It protects steadiness. And once you define faithful, resist negotiating with fear. Not with pride, not with rigidity, but with calm commitment is when you should make your faithful practice. When you slip, and you will slip, you will forget a devotion, you'll eat something you didn't intend to, you'll have a day where fatigue wins. The scrupulous response often looks like escalation. Now I need to add something harder, or restarting, or even worse, was that a mortal sin that I forgot to say the third rosary today? It may say, I'll begin again from scratch tomorrow, or have an internal condemnation. But the spiritually healthy response is simpler than that. Acknowledge it without dramatizing it. Do not escalate in compensation. Do not restart the entire season. Simply return. There's something profoundly humbling about quietly returning rather than intensifying. Lent is not fragile. It doesn't shatter because of one imperfect day. And humility grows more reliably through steady return than through a dramatic self-correction. If anything, those small moments of return may be the most formative part of the entire season. The question beneath the question. Very often when someone asks, is my penance enough? That's not actually the real question. The real question is quieter and more vulnerable. Is my love enough? Am I doing enough? Is God pleased with me? Am I enough? Scrupulosity tends to relocate those questions into measurable arenas. If I can perform well enough during Lent, if I can sacrifice correctly, consistently, intensely, then perhaps I can quiet that deeper uncertainty. But Lent is not meant to become a negotiation of worth. If the entire season becomes a way of reassuring yourself that you're acceptable before God, then the focus has shifted from conversion to self-validation. self-verification. And the exhausting part is that self-verification never fully satisfies anxiety. It just demands another metric. So when the question, is my penance enough, surfaces, it can be helpful to pause and ask, what am I really trying to ask here? Often it's not about chocolate or coffee at all. It's about belonging, approval, or belovedness. And that takes us somewhere very important: the order of the gospel. In the gospel accounts, before Jesus enters the desert, something happens first. Remember, at his baptism, the Father declares, "You are my beloved Son." Belovedness precedes fasting. Identity precedes the wilderness. That order is not incidental, it's theological. Jesus does not go into the desert to earn the Father's love. He goes into the desert already secure in it. For the scrupulous soul, the order is deeply corrective. We do not fast in order to secure belovedness. We fast from belovedness. We do not sacrifice in order to prove our worth. We sacrifice as a response to love already given. If that order reverses, if you find yourself thinking that a better Lent will secure more favorable posture with God, then something in the foundation may need recalibrating. The Father's voice comes before the 40 days, and that changes how these 40 days are lived. Pruning through Lent. Lent is often described as pruning, and that metaphor, a good one, because pruning is not punishment. It's not hacking indiscriminately at a tree to see just how much it can endure. A gardener prunes carefully, intentionally, and with the fruit in mind. The purpose is clarity, simplicity, health, and increased vitality. If your Lent feels like self-inflicted depletion, hacking away, rather than intentional refinement, it may be worth asking whether you're pruning or merely exhausting yourself. The church doesn't want to propose Lent as a season of spiritual depletion and punishment. It proposes Lent as a season of purification, which is ordered towards greater love. Pruning removes what obstructs growth. It doesn't remove what sustains life, and that distinction matters, especially for those who are prone to self-imposed severity, like people who struggle with scrupulosity. If your Lent feels heavy in a way that is tightening rather than clarifying, or suffocating rather than clarifying, that is worth paying attention to. There's a difference between a healthy discomfort of growth and a constriction because of anxiety. When we talk about growth, I ask clients to think of a scale of 1 to 10, and 4 to 6 is where we have good growth. If it's under 4, it may not be challenging enough to create change, but anything over could get in the way of growing. We have to return to the essentials. The church has already told you what is required. Stay there if you need to. There's no virtue in layering complexity onto a nervous system that is already strained. If scrupulosity is driving your experience, please speak with a confessor who understands scrupulosity specifically. This is so important. I've been pleasantly surprised with how many priests have a good understanding of scrupulosity, but not every priest has that deep formation in obsessive patterns. And that's not a criticism, it's just a reality. And to be fair, it's not really their lane. You need someone who understands the difference between contrition and compulsion. And if anxiety is significantly impairing your peace, appropriate psychological support is not a betrayal of faith. It's actually an act of stewardship. Grace doesn't bypass the nervous system, it works through it. Sometimes the most mature spiritual decision you can make is to reduce intensity and increase clarity. If you want more information on scrupulosity, this may be a good place to let you know about our online course, Freedom from Scrupulosity and Intrusive Thoughts, a Catholic educational approach. This is an online course that you can take at your own time in your own house, where I lay out almost everything I know about scrupulosity and intrusive thoughts to give you a good foundation and understanding so that you understand what's happening, get some thoughts on some things you can do, and to give you some guidelines for when you may need to get professional help. There's over 100-page workbook that goes with it, so you've got lots of great stuff, including scripts for how to talk with friends and priests, and a letter that I've written that you can give to your confessor that helps explain OCD and scrupulosity. A steady Lent may be the holiest Lent. We tend to romanticize dramatic Lents, a heroic fast, a radical sacrifice, the visible transformation. But often the holiest Lent is quiet. It's steady, faithful, relational, rooted in trust, and sometimes in the quiet and hidden ways. It may not look impressive from the outside. It may not generate stories or lots of Instagram views. It may not feel epic, but it gradually reshapes your interior life in a meaningful way. It softens the tone, it steadies your reactions, it deepens your prayer in small and consistent ways that are meaningful. And sometimes the most authentic evidence that your Lent is working is that people who live with you experience more patience from you. That is not a small thing, that is fruit. Lent is return. Lent is not a performance. It's not a competition. It's not a spiritual stress test designed to measure just how serious you are. At its heart, Lent is a return to simplicity, clarity, and most importantly, to the Father's heart. For people who struggle with scrupulosity, that return often looks less like escalation and more like steadiness and trusting and tolerating uncertainty. It may look less like proving and more like trusting, less like tightening and more like surrendering what was never meant to be carried alone. And when Lent becomes a return instead of proving ground, something very important starts to shift. The desert becomes quieter. The 40 days become formative rather than frantic. And that is where real conversion happens. If this resonates with you, especially if you notice that Lent tends to amplify your scrupulous patterns, I have an entire Lent playlist specifically addressing scrupulosity, anxiety, confession fears, and how to discern what's actually sin versus scrupulous distortion. I've also created a video called The Complete Guide to a Fruitful Lent for those who struggle with scrupulosity that I'll link right here. This is where I walk you step by step through how to choose penances, how to define faithful, and how to respond when you slip, and how to stay grounded in church teaching without letting anxiety hijack this season. I'll link them below, and I'll make sure that we put them on the end card coming up next. Because Lent should deepen your freedom, not intensify your fear. No matter how tangled your Lent feels right now, and even if you're still sorting out what faithfulness looks like, remember, there's always room for you on the Catholic couch.